Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to be here with you. I have spent the last 15 years of my career as an academic here at the Judge Business School studying this phenomenon of frugal innovation. In the first part of these 15 years, I studied this phenomenon in the private sector, where I've noticed around the world increasingly small teams, sometimes of our students, can now do what only large companies or the government could have done 10 or 20 years ago. And we see these teams develop highly affordable solutions faster, better, and cheaper across sectors. Very often, these private sector solutions address problems in the social space and impinge on public services and the state. We see this phenomenon across the board. We see it in software, WhatsApp being a great example, where just 4 people in a short period of time with relatively small amounts of money came up with something millions of people around the world use, creating value for a lot of people and also for the founders. We see the same phenomenon in hardware. Right here in Cambridge, one of our former mature students, Eben, and his team came up with the Raspberry Pi, a very cheap computer for kids to learn how to code with and to tinker with. And they have gone on to sell millions of these. They sell something like 7 million every year. We see this phenomenon in emerging markets like Kenya, where in 2007, Vodafone's subsidiary introduced a service called M-Pesa, which enables a lady like that from a village in Kenya to use her basic phone to call her son, who works in Nairobi in the formal economy, not only to speak to him, but also to ask him to send money home in emergency, which he can do so simply by texting it to her, and she receives money. So this is frugal money transfer and mobile payments. And we see this phenomenon in the developed world. This is a spin-out of UC Berkeley called CellScope, who have a whole suite of medical devices that leverage the computing power and connectivity of cell phones, of smartphones, to do telemedicine. So here they have an otoscope that connects into the audio jack of the phone and enables a mother to do telemedicine, as you see there. This is an otoscope that a mother can use to take high-resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter when she has an infection and send those images to a consultant who's somewhere else. This device is a fraction of the cost of the standalone device, and they've come up with other such medical devices like dermoscopes and so on. So this is quite a universal phenomenon. And in the initial period, around late 2000s and early 2010s, my co-authors and I researched this in emerging markets and wrote a book about that phenomenon in emerging markets. We called the book Jugaad Innovation, and Jugaad is the Hindi word for this kind of frugal, flexible, and inclusive innovation. And then a few years later, we published a follow-up book called Frugal Innovation, which was specifically about this phenomenon in the West for the West, where we looked at how large corporations were doing this kind of frugal innovation alongside their more expensive R&D. Now, whenever I spoke about these 2 books to any kind of audience, somebody invariably would ask me the question of what this meant for governments. So I began to think about that question, and I realized that often they were asking 2 related questions. One is, how can governments themselves do this kind of frugal innovation to deliver better for their citizens? But they were also asking the question about what is the government's role in terms of cultivating and regulating this kind of innovation in the economy. So I began to think about that question and wrote a 3rd book, which was specifically about what this meant for governments and how governments should be in a world of these new technologies and this phenomenon of frugal innovation. So when I was researching this question of how a government should be and this book, I, of course, became aware of a very long debate between 2 very differing views on how a government should be. On the one hand, we have libertarians who are skeptical of government. They believe that governments are inefficient and ineffective at best, and possibly even dangerous at worst. Statists, on the other hand, are quite sanguine about government. They believe often that government's the only force that can redress the vagaries and injustices of nature or the market. And so when I was thinking about this, I realized that, yes, there's an element of truth to these 2 positions, but there is a vast space in between, a very pragmatic space where often governments have a lot to do, and more so every day. So how could they do that efficiently and effectively? And of course, without trampling on our freedoms, and do that both in times of stability as well as crisis. So in the book, I decided to take on this question and do it empirically by looking at cases from around the world. And I started with a case that I'm quite familiar with because it is from my home country of India. This was an initiative that was introduced by the central government in 2009, where they invited somebody from the private sector, Nandan Nilekani, one of the co-founders of India's most successful software company, to come into government to lead this initiative to give every Indian a unique ID, a 12-digit number that would be linked to their fingerprints and their iris scan. And the idea here was to solve two problems that India faced. One was half the population, often the most underserved population, that was the target of many government programs, who couldn't claim those benefits because they had no form of ID. To solve that problem, but also to solve another problem of a lot of fake IDs in the system where people were drawing on state benefits and defrauding the state. So by having a unique ID, they would solve both these problems. And they went about doing this in a very unusual way, which turned out to be not only frugal, but also quite quick. And they were able to issue over 1 billion IDs in about 5 years at about $1 an ID. And now every Indian practically has one of these. In the first year that they connected, they linked the unique ID to people's bank accounts and to the benefit system, they were able to save more than they spent on the whole project simply by removing fraud or ghost beneficiaries in the system. So by looking at this case, I concluded that there are ways in which governments today can do very large-scale projects like this fairly efficiently and effectively, although, of course, they create new problems, problems of privacy and security of the data. And that's when you need other parts of the state system and civil society to come in. You need the judiciary to come in. You need the press to come in, and so on, to hold the government to account. So in the book, after beginning with that particular case, I then go on to argue and show how governments can use new technologies and forms of organization to be able to do things efficiently and effectively without trampling on people's freedoms. And the 5 principles that I highlight in the book are the following. So first, very important, I show with examples and cases that governments are responsive to the needs of citizens and develop solutions outside in, starting with the citizen's perspective and then working towards solutions. Second, of being inclusive in their approach and balancing the needs of different parts of the citizenry, parts that might sometimes be in conflict. Third, being experimental, trying out new ideas, testing them, gathering evidence, and then using that evidence to scale the idea. Fourth, being entrepreneurial, being proactive, and meeting new ideas, new technologies, and new companies early to be able to steer rather than row towards a better outcome. And finally, of course, making the whole government innovative and creating a culture of innovation in government. So that was the book, and it came out in 2021. But since then, a lot has happened in this space, and I particularly want to talk about one development that I have kept a close eye on, which is this idea of digital public infrastructure. India has made great progress in this space, and it's all started with that unique ID I talked about that every Indian now has. So that's the base of what's called India Stack. And above that, we have several layers. First, we have electronic Know Your Customer. This is what banks all need to be able to include new customers. So on top of the UID, you have eKYC. On top of that, you have what's called a Unified Payments Interface. This consists of a number of interoperable open source APIs that allow people to create apps that we can use to then make money transfers, payments using our phones, regardless of what mobile phone company we use, regardless of what bank we use. And then there's a consent layer and an account aggregator. This stack together allows digital identity verification, cashless and paperless financial transactions, secure data sharing, digital document storage and verification. And together, this has created the opportunity for huge financial inclusion. Over hundreds of millions of Indians who are in the cash economy, in the informal economy, are now in the banking system. Having had this success, There's been some development in thinking more generally about the importance of these digital public goods. And some of the principles are to have open APIs that are interoperable and modular. This makes the whole system frugal. What that then does is it creates affordable solutions which are available to many people, including low-income communities in rural areas on the demand side. It brings a lot of people into the formal economy who are otherwise shut out. And on the supply side, it creates opportunities for new startups, so fintech startups, to use these digital tools, this infrastructure, to create apps that they can charge people for. And this has created a fintech revolution in India with a large number of payments unicorns, for instance. And then, of course, eventually you also need to have various arms of the state, like the central bank and the various regulators, to ensure that all this is done with due attention to privacy and security. Now, having achieved that kind of understanding, the ecosystem in India, which is a public-private ecosystem, it's not just the state. It consists of the central government. It consists of various other arms like the central bank, but it also consists of a lot of other banks that form a consortium. They're now thinking about how to extend this to more general open transaction networks. And the idea is to go back to the original principles of the internet and to GPS and mobile, where anybody could not only speak to anybody on the internet, but also transact with them. We unfortunately went into a world of platforms which inserted themselves between each of us and take all the value. We now want to move, in the Indian ecosystem, want to move back to protocols, so where you don't have centralized intermediaries that concentrate economic value and power, and you don't have silos and barriers to entry. You move from store of value to flow of value, and you have an open, equitable, and inclusive system. Now, this approach is being applied in open network digital commerce, so you can think of this as being peer-to-peer equivalents of Amazon, for instance, which is programmable, innovation-friendly, and digital. It's based on an open-source universal transaction protocol, and this has now been introduced in India and has begun to scale quite dramatically across cities and across retailers. The same idea is being applied to mobility. So you could think of this as being an open network to compete with Uber, which is a platform. This is being applied in my hometown of Bangalore, where you have peer-to-peer mobility networks, empowering local drivers and increasing last-mile affordability. And the idea is that instead of having a platform that not only creates value, but also captures that value that the platform typically captures from both sides of the market can now be shared with both sides of the market, because you don't need the platform. And again, this has begun to scale quite dramatically. And finally, another example of this thinking is being applied to what's being called the unified energy interface, where the idea is that anyone who has any spare source of energy, solar in a battery or through an electric vehicle, can then sell it to someone else because the grid is also financialized. And again, we are seeing some traction and scaling here. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about now how AI is being layered on top of all these ideas, how AI becomes a part of this digital public infrastructure. And I want to talk about a particular Indian startup, Sarvam.ai, partly because I know one of the founders. He was a classmate of mine, and I know quite a lot about their thinking. So they told me that when ChatGPT came out, they realized this was huge for a country like India, because suddenly it now became possible for them to develop say, a personal tutor for every kid that they could get access to on their phone in a remote part of India in their language in voice, or for every adult to get access to their own personal GP on their phone in voice in their language. And because India has already had a tradition of doing tech differently and frugally, they thought they could do this with their company, use open models, develop smaller large language models in specific domains like education and health. And actually, this thinking is now fed into this idea of the four internets. The idea that the internet has gone off in different directions in different parts of the world. In the US, very commercially driven and dominated, particularly at the moment. In Brussels, we have perhaps the regulators with a little bit more control, but even they might fine Google a few billion, and Google makes up that money in a week. Then you have the Beijing equivalent, where the state doesn't like what Alibaba is doing. Jack Ma disappears for a few months and everything is back to normal. Here we now have a fourth alternative, an open internet that is really true to the original principles of what the internet was all about. So let me just conclude by saying, as all these new technologies come on board, AI being an example, I believe that companies, the state, and communities have a huge role to play to ensure that we get the benefits of these technologies without the downsides, and that in that way we can innovate in a frugal and flexible way for the benefit of everyone. Thank you so much.